At my husband's funeral, my daughter called me a burden and gave me 1 month to leave my home. She never expected my new job would be caring for a paralyzed billionaire, or that he was the man I was supposed to marry 48 years ago. By the time she came crawling back for money, I was already writing her out of his will. My husband Robert's funeral was a study in beige. The church walls, the bland casseroles that appeared on our doorstep, the muted tones of the mourners, it all blended into a single colorless hum. I sat in the front pew, a widow of 3 days, feeling less like a participant and more like a piece of furniture that had been draped in black for the occasion. My daughter Chloe sat beside me, her back ramrod straight. She held my hand, but her grip was cool and formal, the dutiful grasp of an actress playing a role. She had organized everything with a terrifying efficiency that left no room for my grief. The casket, the eulogy, the pale lilies that flanked the altar. I had simply nodded along a spectator to the tidy packaging of my 49-year marriage. People came to me, their faces etched with a practiced sympathy, and whispered condolences. "He was a good man, Helen," they said. "A pillar of the community." I knew they were right. Robert had been a good man, a steady man. He provided. He was dependable as the sunrise. Our life together had been a long, quiet river, not a raging sea. He had been my port after a storm I'd nearly forgotten, and I had loved him for the safety he offered. But as I sat there, the scent of lilies and dust thick in the air, the silence in my own heart, was the most deafening sound in the room. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of unspoken words, of paths not taken. I thought of the Stoic philosophers Robert used to read, how they believed we should accept fate with calm indifference. But there was no calm in my heart, only a vast, hollow ache. Chloe's phone buzzed discreetly in her purse. I watched her thumb swipe across the screen, her eyes scanning a message. A small, tight frown appeared between her brows before being smoothed away into a mask of solemnity. She was already moving on her mind on schedules and logistics. I, on the other hand, felt anchored to this pew, a ghost already beginning to haunt the life I no longer recognized. I was not just Helen Roberts' wife. I was now Helen Roberts' widow. I could feel the title settling over me like a shroud, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that in my daughter's eyes, this new title meant I was a problem to be managed. The slow eraser had already begun its work, and my story was being written over before it had even ended. The pastor's voice droned on, speaking of heaven and eternal rest, but my mind was elsewhere. It was drifting back to a time of vibrant color of summer afternoons, under a weeping willow of a love so bright it felt like it could light up the world. A memory I had carefully boxed up and stored in the attic of my mind for nearly 50 years. It was a dangerous memory, one that had no place here in this beige, colorless world of loss. But it whispered to me, nonetheless, a reminder that before I was a wife and a mother, I was a girl with a heart full of dreams. And I wondered, as the final prayer was said, if any part of that girl still remained. The days following the funeral blurred into a quiet routine of erasure. It began subtly. Chloe, who had moved into our guest room with her husband Mark, just to help out, started by rearranging the living room. "It's too cluttered, Mom," she'd said, her voice bright and brittle. "Let's create more light, more space." Her words were framed as a kindness, an act of modernizing and decluttering. But I knew what it really was. It was the first stroke of the slow eraser. My husband's favorite leather armchair, the one with the worn-down arms where his hands always rested as he read the evening paper, was the first to go. It was more than a chair. It was the geography of our evenings, a silent testament to 49 years of shared quiet. Mark, a man whose primary role in life was to nod in agreement with his wife, grunted as he hauled it to the garage. He didn't meet my eye. "It's for the best, Helen," he mumbled, as if convincing himself. I said nothing. I watched as my life, the shared history of half a century, was curated into oblivion. Then came Robert's collection of history books, boxed up and labeled donations. The photographs on the mantelpiece were next. The one of Robert and me on our 25th anniversary, his arm wrapped securely around my waist, was replaced by a sleek minimalist vase holding a single artificial orchid. A picture of Chloe's recent trip to Cabo took the place of a faded snapshot of me young and laughing from a time before her. I was becoming an ancestor in my own home. I had become a tolerated ghost. I would sit in the living room, a room that was becoming less familiar each day, and feel like wallpaper that hurt. My presence was a pattern they wished they could paint over. My coffee mug, the one with the chipped rim that I'd used every morning for 20 years, disappeared from the cupboard. I found it later, nested inside a box of old newspapers in the recycling bin, a silent ceramic casualty of their campaign. Chloe's voice was always laced with a saccharine concern that didn't quite mask the steel beneath it. "You shouldn't be cooking, Mom. You need to rest," she'd chirp before preparing a meal of kale salad and quinoa that left me feeling hollow and cold. My role at the dinner table shrank. I went from matriarch to guest. Soon I felt like a tenant. Chloe and Mark would discuss their finances in low, urgent whispers, their conversation halting whenever I entered the room. I'd hear phrases on the wind, sharp little fragments that pierced the quiet. The mortgage, unexpected expenses, long-term solution. I knew without being told that I was the long-term unexpected expense. I was the line item they were figuring out how to cut. My life, my home, my very existence had been demoted to a logistical problem, a number on a spreadsheet that needed to be zeroed out. The final insult came not with a bang, but with the cold, sterile click of a spreadsheet being closed. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral. I was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes, the warm water, a small comfort on my aching hands. Chloe walked in her laptop tucked under her arm like a weapon. She didn't look at me. She placed the laptop on the table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, her movements crisp and deliberate. The sound of it hitting the wood was a gavel falling. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. It was the tone of a superior addressing an underperforming employee. I dried my hands on a dish towel, a familiar sense of dread coiling in my stomach. I sat down, my back straight, a silent refusal to show the weakness she expected. She opened the laptop, revealing columns of numbers and figures that swam before my eyes. "Mark and I have been running the numbers." She began, her gaze fixed on the screen. "With Dad gone, his pension is gone. The house is paid for, thank God, but the property taxes, the utilities, the upkeep. It's a lot." She finally met my eyes, and they were cold and hard as river stones. There was no grief for her father in them, no love for her mother, only impatience. The reality is we can't afford to carry you. You're not contributing. The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Carry you, as if I were a sack of stones, a piece of old furniture they had inherited and now had to dispose of. I thought of the 2 jobs I'd worked to help her through college, of the down payment for her first condo that had come from my and Robert's savings, of the countless hours I'd spent babysitting her son so she could build her career. My entire life had been an act of contribution, a silent, steady pouring of myself into the foundations of her own success. "What are you saying, Chloe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, though it felt like a scream in my own ears. "I'm saying you need to pull your weight," she said, her voice hardening. "You're 68, you're still healthy. You need to get a job, something, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. We're selling the house. It's too big for us, and the equity is something we need to access now for our future." There it was. The cold, hard truth laid bare on my kitchen table. I was dead weight. A burden to be shed so she could build her future on the ashes of my past. I looked at the face of the child I had raised a stranger, wearing my daughter's skin, and I felt the last vestiges of my old life crumble into dust. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. The shock had built a wall inside me so thick that no tear could escape. I simply stood up from the table where I had fed her, nursed her, and loved her, and walked out of the room. I was no longer confused. I was no longer waiting for an apology. I was planning. I went to my bedroom and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the first decision I had made for myself in weeks, and it resonated through the house like a gunshot. My hands were trembling, not from fear or weakness, but from a strange, cold anger that was solidifying in my veins. I did not feel despair. I did not feel pity for myself. I felt clarity. It was a terrible, beautiful, and utterly clarifying moment. The illusions had been stripped away. I saw my daughter for who she truly was, not the child I had raised, but a stranger motivated by a chilling pragmatism. And I saw my situation with an unflinching honesty. I was homeless, or soon would be. I was 68 years old with a resume that had ended decades ago, a relic from a time when homemaker was a respected, if unpaid, profession. I was by all practical measures adrift in a world that had no place for women like me. The Japanese have a concept, mono no aware. The gentle sadness of things, the awareness of their impermanence. For years I had felt that about my life with Robert, a quiet acceptance of aging and eventual loss. But this was different. This was not a gentle fading. This was a violent shoving out. But I did not weep. I did not pace the room. I went to the small electric kettle I kept on my dresser, and I did the only thing that made sense. I simply made tea. As the water heated its low hum, a comforting presence in the suffocating silence. I sat in the rocking chair by the window the one Chloe had complained was a fire hazard, and cluttered up the room. I looked out at the garden Robert and I had planted together, our shared legacy of irises and roses. The roses were in full bloom, their defiant color, a stark contrast to the beige world my life had become. As I sipped the hot chamomile, a plan began to form. It wasn't a grand strategy for revenge or a bitter plot to make my daughter suffer. It was something far more essential. It was a simple, pragmatic plan for survival. My pride was a shattered thing, a piece of old china swept into a dustpan. But my dignity, I realized, was still intact. It was the one thing she could not take from me. I would not be a charity case. I would not beg. I would stand on my own 2 feet, however unsteady they might be. I retrieved my old laptop from a dusty case under the bed. The battery was long dead, but I found the cord and plugged it in the small charging light, a tiny beacon in the dim room. As it whirred to life, I opened a web browser, the screen casting a pale blue light on my face. My fingers, stiff with age and a lifetime of domestic work, hovered over the keyboard. Then, with a deep breath that was half a prayer and half a war cry, I typed the words that would be the first step into my new, unknown life: high-end caregiver agencies in Virginia. I was not just looking for a job. I was looking for an escape hatch from the life that was being erased around me. I was searching for a new beginning in the last place I ever expected to find one. The next morning, the house was silent. Chloe and Mark had left early for work, leaving behind a sterile quiet that felt more like an absence than peace. I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open before me, and began making calls. The first few agencies were polite but dismissive, their voices dripping with a gentle condescension that was somehow more insulting than outright rejection. Most of our clients prefer caregivers with recent certifications. Mrs. Thompson. One young woman chirped, her voice too bright. Do you have any experience with geriatric medicine? My experience raising a child, running a household for 50 years, and caring for my own aging parents through their final difficult years, it seemed, did not qualify. My life's work was invisible to them, unquantifiable on a resume. I was just an old woman, a blank slate. The rejections stung, but the cold clarity from the day before held me steady. I was not asking for a favor. I was offering a service. I was reliable, patient, and had a lifetime of experience in compassionate care, even if it wasn't stamped on a certificate. I remembered a quote from Maya Angelou that my mother used to love. I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. That was my qualification. On my 4th call to an agency with a discreet, elegant name, the Sterling Group, something shifted. The woman on the phone, a Ms. Albright, had a calm, professional voice that held no hint of condescension. Helen Thompson, she repeated after I introduced myself. Tell me about your background. I didn't speak of my recent widowhood or my daughter's cruel ultimatum. I spoke of my life as a source of strength, not of pity. I spoke of managing a home, of balancing budgets, of my organizational skills, of my quiet discretion. I didn't know why, but I felt I had to present myself not as a desperate woman, but as a capable one. I had to redefine my own value before I could ask anyone else to see it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. It's unusual, Ms. Albright said. Finally, her voice thoughtful. But we have a particular client. High profile and intensely private. The family has been through a string of younger certified nurses who lacked a certain maturity. They were more interested in their phones than the patient. The client requires absolute discretion. No social media, no gossip. He values quiet companionship as much as clinical care. She explained the role. It was a live-in position for a wealthy recluse a man paralyzed from the waist down after an accident years ago. The pay was substantial, far more than I could have imagined. An interview was scheduled for the following day at their downtown office. I hung up the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. It felt like a lifeline. That evening, when Chloe came home, her face already etched with the impatience of seeing me still there, I met her at the door. "I have a job interview tomorrow," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'll be moving out by the end of the week." She looked stunned. Then a flicker of relief quickly crossed her face. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "That's wonderful. See, I knew you could do it if you just applied yourself." She had no idea that the woman she'd just patronized was about to step into a world she couldn't possibly imagine, a world where my worth would not be measured on a spreadsheet. The Sterling Group's office was intimidating, all glass and brushed steel, a world away from the chintz and faded photographs of my life. Ms. Albright was as crisp and professional as her voice, and after a short but intense interview, she looked at me over the rim of her severe black-framed glasses. "The client's estate manager has agreed to see you now." There was no time to feel nervous, no time for second thoughts. A black car, silent and imposing as a hearse, was waiting for me at the curb. We drove for nearly an hour, leaving the city behind and winding our way into the rolling hills of the Virginia countryside, a landscape of horse farms and old money. We turned onto a private road flanked by ancient stone walls that seemed to whisper of secrets and pedigrees, and approached a set of magnificent wrought iron gates. They swung open without a sound, operated by an invisible hand. The estate was breathtaking. A long, winding driveway curved through acres of manicured lawns and towering oak trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. In the distance, a sprawling stone mansion rose from the earth, looking less like a home and more like a European palace transplanted onto American soil. It was beautiful, but it was a lonely, formidable kind of beauty. There was a stillness to the place, a sense of profound and untouchable isolation. This was not a home. It was a fortress against the world. I was led inside by a severe-looking woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Mrs. Davenport, the estate manager. Her posture was as rigid as her title. The interior was opulent, but cold, filled with priceless art that hung on the walls like silent, judgmental observers, and antique furniture that seemed to stand at attention. Every surface gleamed. The air itself felt polished, scrubbed of any trace of warmth or life. Mr. Vance values his privacy above all else. Mrs. Davenport stated, her voice devoid of emotion, as she led me down a long hall, our footsteps echoing on the marble floor. "Your duties will be to assist him with his daily non-medical needs. Reading to him, assisting with correspondence companionship. The nursing staff handles all medical procedures. You are here for the human element, which I must say has been lacking." The unspoken criticism of her previous hires hung in the air. "You will sign a non-disclosure agreement." She continued her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "Nothing you see or hear within these walls ever leaves them. Nothing. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I was entering a gilded cage, a place of immense wealth and profound isolation. But for the first time in a long time, It felt like a cage of my own choosing. Mrs. Davenport stopped before a set of heavy oak doors that looked as if they guarded the secrets of a kingdom. "He will see you now," she announced, and with a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a world I never could have imagined. Mrs. Davenport opened the doors and gestured for me to enter. The room was a library, a magnificent two-story space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a rolling ladder, and a large, unlit fireplace that gaped like a cavern. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and something else, something faintly medicinal. In the center of the room, positioned before a wall of windows that overlooked a vast, somber garden, was a man in a sophisticated motorized wheelchair. His back was to me. I could only see the sharp, elegant line of his shoulders in a cashmere sweater and the silver hair at his temples. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of the chair's electronics. "Mr. Vance," Mrs. Davenport announced, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "This is Mrs. Helen Thompson." He turned the chair slowly, with a smooth, silent grace. The first thing I noticed were his eyes. They were a startling shade of blue, the color of a winter sky framed by a handsome, weary face. They were intelligent, perceptive, and filled with a profound sadness that seemed to pull all the light in the room toward them. He looked at me, a polite but distant curiosity in his gaze, the look of a king surveying a new courtier. "Mrs. Thompson," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, cultured and quiet. It was a voice that held an undeniable authority even in its softness. And it was a voice that struck a chord deep within me, a faint, dissonant memory I couldn't grasp. A ghost of a sound from a lifetime ago. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Vance," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in the grand room. I instinctively started to extend my hand, then caught myself and let it fall to my side. He noticed the aborted gesture, and a flicker of something amusement regret crossed his face. "I don't do handshakes," he said, not unkindly. He gestured with a slight movement of his head toward his legs, which were covered by a fine cashmere blanket. An old-fashioned sentiment that requires a mobility I no longer possess. The interview, if it could be called that, was brief and unorthodox. He didn't ask about my qualifications or my past employment. He asked me about the last book I'd read. He asked me if I played chess. He asked me if I believed that a garden could have a soul. All the while, he watched me intently, his blue eyes seeming to search for something in my face, something beyond the wrinkles and the tired set of my shoulders. I felt a strange sense of being known, of being seen in a way I hadn't been for years. It was unnerving and, in a strange way, comforting. "You'll do," he said finally, the words delivered as a simple statement of fact. He turned his chair back toward the window, a clear dismissal. "Mrs. Davenport will show you to your quarters. You may begin in the morning." I was dismissed. As I walked out of the library, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a soft thud, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just met a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. The echo of his voice followed me, a ghost from a faded photograph, a melody from a song whose name I had long forgotten. My life at the Vance estate settled into a quiet, monastic rhythm. My quarters were a lovely suite of rooms more luxurious than any I had ever known, with silk wallpaper and a view of the formal gardens. I was a world away from the house Chloe was so eager to sell, a world away from the slow, painful erasure of my previous life. Here, I had a purpose. My existence was not a problem to be solved, but a service to be rendered. My days were spent with Mr. Vance. I read to him from the classics Dickens, Tolstoy, Austen, my voice filling the silence of the grand library. We played chess on a beautiful ivory board, his mind razor sharp and strategic, a stark contrast to his imprisoned body. I wrote letters for him his business correspondence dictated in that same resonant voice that continued to tug at the edges of my memory. He was a man of immense intellect and deep, abiding melancholy. He rarely spoke of his past or the accident that had confined him to his chair 10 years prior. He was guarded private, a fortress unto himself. And yet, in small, incremental ways, he began to open up to me. A slow thaw began. He told me his first name was Arthur. The name was so simple, so common, yet it landed in my heart like a stone in a still pond, sending out ripples of a forgotten familiarity. Slowly, the formal barrier between Mr. Vance and Mrs. Thompson began to dissolve. We discovered a shared love for old black and white films and the same obscure poetry. One afternoon, while I was reading a poem by Keats aloud, he finished a line from memory, his voice a soft murmur. I looked up from the page, surprised. He offered a rare, fleeting smile and expression that transformed his weary face, giving me a glimpse of the young man he must have been. My mother used to read that to me, he said softly, a confession disguised as a simple statement. The moments of connection grew small but significant. A shared joke over a particularly ruthless chess move. A knowing glance when a character in a novel reminded us of the formidable Mrs. Davenport. He started asking about my life, and I found myself telling him about Robert, about my love for gardening, about the quiet, simple life I had lived. I never spoke of Chloe or the circumstances that brought me to his door. I felt instinctively that this place was a sanctuary from that pain, and to speak of it would be to poison the well. But the familiarity of him, that persistent echo in his voice, the way he looked at me sometimes, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. It was a constant, unsettling whisper in the back of my mind. It was like trying to remember the lyrics to a song you loved as a child. The melody was there, haunting and beautiful, but the words remained just out of reach, lost in the fog of time. I pushed the feeling away, telling myself it was foolishness, the fantasy of a lonely old woman. But the feeling persisted, a slow, insistent thawing of a memory I had frozen solid a lifetime ago. The discovery happened on a rainy Thursday. The sky was the color of bruised plums, and a steady drizzle wept against the tall library windows. Arthur had asked me to organize his personal study, a smaller, more intimate room adjacent to the library, paneled in dark cherry wood. It was a task of trust, I knew. The room was a mausoleum of his past life, filled with old business ledgers, silver-plated trophies from forgotten polo matches, and boxes of personal effects that hadn't been touched in years. Just try to make some sense of it all. Helen, he'd said, his voice unusually strained. I haven't the heart to face it myself. I worked quietly, the only sound the soft rustle of paper and the drumming of the rain. I sorted through papers and artifacts of a life lived at the highest levels of business and society, a life of power and influence that felt a million miles from my own. In the bottom drawer of a heavy mahogany desk, My fingers brushed against a small, velvet-wrapped object tucked away in the back corner. Curious, I pulled it out and unwrapped it carefully. It was a silver picture frame tarnished with the dark patina of age. Inside, under a pane of dusty glass, was a faded black and white photograph of a young woman. She was standing under a weeping willow tree, laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy, her hair a cascade of dark curls falling over her shoulders. My breath caught in my throat. My heart stopped, then started again, with a painful, violent lurch. I was looking at myself. It was me at 18 years old on a picnic by the river during that one perfect sun-drenched summer, a lifetime ago. A girl I barely recognized, a girl incandescent with a hope and a fire that had long since been banked and cooled to embers. I sank into the leather desk chair, the frame trembling in my hands. Memories I had buried for nearly 50 years, buried under the foundations of a marriage and a life I had chosen, as a consolation, came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. The willow tree, the checkered blanket, the young man behind the camera, the boy with the startling blue eyes and the deep, resonant voice, the boy I was going to marry, the boy who had shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. Arthur, my Arthur. The room began to spin. Mr. Arthur Vance, the paralyzed billionaire, the cold and distant recluse, was the boy I had given my whole heart to 48 years ago. The boy who had disappeared from my life without a word, leaving me with nothing but a shattered heart and a universe of unanswered questions. The melody, I couldn't place the voice that echoed from the past. It all crashed together in a deafening crescendo of recognition. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It was sitting in a wheelchair in the next room. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the photograph of the girl I used to be, the ghost of her laughter echoing in the silent room. My past and present had collided with such force, it left me breathless. My carefully ordered world, the one I had built on the foundations of loss and resignation, had been turned upside down. With the silver frame clutched in my hand like a holy relic, I walked back into the library where Arthur was sitting, a lone ship in a vast, quiet sea, staring out at the rain-streaked garden. My movements felt robotic, detached, as if I were watching myself in a film. "Arthur," I said. My voice was a raw, unfamiliar sound scraped from the bottom of my soul. He turned his chair a question in his intelligent blue eyes. When he saw the photograph in my hand, his face went pale. The polite mask, the weary composure he wore like armor, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. For the first time, I saw the vulnerable man beneath it all. And the sight was so shocking, it was like seeing a statue weep. "Where did you find that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual resonant authority. "In your desk," I said, my own voice shaking so hard the words trembled in the air. "It's me. You knew. You've known this whole time, haven't you?" The accusation was hot and bitter on my tongue. He closed his eyes, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping him, the sound of a pain too old to bear. "Not at first," he admitted, his voice thick with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "When you first walked into this room, there was something, a ghost of a memory. Your voice, the way you hold your head when you're thinking. But I told myself it was impossible. The Helen I knew was gone, lost to me forever. And then day by day, listening to you read, watching you play chess. I knew. I just didn't know how to say it. What could I possibly say after all this time? You could have started with why you disappeared. I said, the bitterness of a half-century-old wound rising in my throat. Why you left me without a word. I wrote to you. I waited. I thought I wasn't good enough. That my love wasn't enough. The final words were a choked whisper, the secret shame I had carried my entire adult life. His eyes, those startling blue eyes now swimming with unshed tears, locked onto mine with a desperate intensity. Left, he said, his voice cracking, incredulous. Helen, I never left you. I never would have left you. I wrote to you every single day for 6 months. You never answered. It was you who disappeared. You were the one who broke my heart. We stared at each other across the chasm of 48 years, two people who had loved each other with the fierce, absolute certainty of youth, each believing the other had been the one to walk away. The air in the room was thick with our shared mistaken history, a toxic fog of lies and misunderstandings. And in that moment, I knew that the story I had told myself about my life, the story of being abandoned by the great love of my life, was a lie. But if it was a lie, then who had been the author? Who had penned our tragedy? The truth, when it came, was uglier and more painful than the simple abandonment we had both believed in for so long. Over the next few hours, sitting in the quiet, fire-lit library as the storm raged outside, we began to piece together the puzzle of our past. We were like two archaeologists carefully brushing the dust off a fragile, buried history, revealing the sharp, broken edges of what had been stolen from us. Arthur spoke first, his voice heavy with the weight of an old, cold anger. He told me of his parents, wealthy and proud, who had vehemently disapproved of his relationship with me, a girl from a simple working-class family with no pedigree to her name. They saw you as beneath me. He said the words tasting like poison in his mouth. A summer distraction. They had a suitable girl picked out for me, the daughter of a business associate, a merger of fortunes disguised as a marriage. He had been sent to a university in Europe for a year, a move strategically designed by his parents to sever our connection. I fought them, Helen, he said, his hands clenching on the arms of his chair. But I was 18. I thought a year was a short price to pay for a lifetime with you. I promised I would write every day and that I would come back for you. And he did write. Passionate, desperate letters full of his love and his plans for our future, plans for a small house with a garden, a life far away from his parents' suffocating influence. Letters I never received. My own story tumbled out then, a torrent of memory and pain I had held back for a lifetime. It echoed his with a terrible, tragic symmetry. My parents, practical and cautious, had been deeply suspicious of Arthur and his wealthy family. They were convinced he was just a rich boy toying with my affections, that he would never truly leave his world for mine. They feared I would be hurt, and in their fear, they became the instruments of that very pain. They told me I was foolish to believe you. I whispered the words catching in my throat. They said your kind always breaks their promises, that your world and my world could never meet. I had written to him too, pouring my lonely, aching heart out onto pages that I mailed with trembling hands, running to the mailbox every day, waiting for a reply that never came. After months of crushing silence, heartbroken and convinced he had forgotten me, just as my parents had predicted, I finally gave up. I allowed my heart to break. I believed he had simply moved on, that my parents had been right all along. I eventually met Robert, a kind and steady man who offered a safe harbor from the storm of my grief. And I buried the memory of Arthur so deep, I almost convinced myself he had never existed. We sat in silence, the terrible truth settling upon us like a shroud. It was so simple, so common, so breathtakingly cruel. Our parents, his out of snobbery and mine, out of a misguided, fearful love, had conspired to keep us apart. They had intercepted our letters, fed us lies, and ruthlessly pruned our young love from the vine. They had been the architects of our lifelong sorrow, building our separate, lonely lives on a foundation of deceit. The final piece of evidence came later that evening. The storm outside had softened to a gentle weeping rain, and the fire in the grate cast long, dancing shadows across the room. After a long emotional silence, a silence filled with the ghosts of what might have been Arthur, directed me back to his personal study. "There's a small, locked chest in the corner," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The key is in the top left drawer of the desk. I haven't opened that box in over 40 years. My hands were steady as I retrieved the small, ornate brass key and knelt before the dark wooden chest. It was a simple thing, a sea captain's chest, bound in iron. The lock was stiff, and the key turned with a reluctant, grinding protest. As I lifted the heavy lid, the scent of old paper and cedar filled the air, a fragrance of preserved memories. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to me in his familiar, elegant script, the ink still dark and clear. But the stamps were uncancelled. They had never been sent. "After 6 months of complete silence from you," he explained from the doorway, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "My mother came to my room. She looked so sad, so sympathetic. She handed me a letter. It was supposedly from you." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "The letter said you had met someone else, a good, steady man from your town. It said you were happy, and that you realized our love was just a youthful fantasy. It asked me very politely not to contact you again, so that you could move on with your new life." The letter, of course, had been a forgery, a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as kindness, a lie crafted by his mother to sever the final thread of hope he clung to. Devastated and believing I had moved on, he stopped writing. But he couldn't bring himself to throw away the letters he'd already penned, the tangible proof of a love he now thought was unrequited. So he had locked them in this chest, a time capsule of a love that had been murdered, a private tomb for his broken heart. My fingers trembled as I untied the brittle blue ribbon. I carefully unfolded the first letter. His words, written by the light of a student lamp in a cold European city 48 years ago, reached across time and touched my soul. He wrote of his loneliness, of his dreams for us, of the color of my eyes and the sound of my laughter. He was so young, so full of hope and love. As I held the brittle paper in my hands, reading his words of love and longing, 48 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled around my heart. The grief was immense, not just for the love we had lost, but for the lives we could have lived, for the children we might have raised, for the decades of shared joy that had been stolen from us. We had been cheated, robbed of a future by the very people who were supposed to protect us. Paper remembers what people forget, and these old, fragile pages had remembered a truth that had the power to either destroy us completely or somehow to finally heal us both. In the weeks that followed our discovery, the atmosphere in the mansion transformed. The heavy, oppressive melancholy that had clung to the walls like ivy began to recede, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like hope. It was as if a window had been thrown open in a dusty, sealed room, letting in the first breath of spring. The dynamic between Arthur and me shifted irrevocably. The formal roles of caregiver and patient dissolved, leaving only Helen and Arthur, two souls who had found each other again across a vast, empty expanse of time. Our days were filled with conversation, a constant, gentle weaving together of our two separate lives. We spoke of everything and nothing. The years we had lost the people, we had become the small joys and quiet sorrows we had endured alone. He told me of the ruthless ambition that drove him to build his financial empire, an ambition he admitted was fueled by the heartbreak he thought I had dealt him. He had tried to build a fortress of success so high that no one could ever hurt him again. I told him of my quiet life with Robert, a life of contentment that had always carried a faint, unspoken undercurrent of what if a ghost I never allowed myself to name. The physical care I provided became an act of intimacy, not of duty. I would help him with his physical therapy exercises, my hands steady on his shoulders, and we would talk our faces close. The barrier of his paralysis, the thing that had defined him for a decade, seemed to fade into the background. I saw not a broken man, but the man I had always known. His brilliant mind and his loving heart, still fiercely intact, trapped but not extinguished. Laughter returned to the house, a sound so alien that the formidable Mrs. Davenport actually smiled when she heard it. I would read him a funny passage from a P.G. Wodehouse novel, and a deep, rumbling laugh would erupt from him, a sound the staff hadn't heard in years. He began taking an interest in the world outside his library again. He asked about the gardens, and together we planned a new rose garden, my hands in the rich soil, and him directing from his chair on the stone patio. We were two people in the autumn of our lives experiencing an impossible second spring. The fiery, impatient love we had felt as teenagers was different now. It was deeper, quieter, enriched by the bittersweet soil of our histories, tempered by loss, and all the more precious for it. One evening, as we sat by the fire listening to the crackle and pop of the logs, he reached out and took my hand. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he couldn't believe it was real. But his grip was warm and firm. Helen. He set his blue eyes searching mine in the flickering light. I've been in this chair for 10 years. For most of that time, I felt my life was over. I was just waiting for the end. A king in a prison of my own making. But since you came back to me, I feel like I'm living again. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Twice. In that moment, I knew I was home. Not in a house, not in a grand mansion, but in the presence of this man. I had come here seeking a job, a refuge from a world that had discarded me. I had found a love I thought was lost forever to memory. News in a small town travels on invisible wires. Though I had kept my new life intensely private, a single trip into town to the local nursery to purchase rose bushes for our new garden was all it took. The owner, a woman I knew vaguely from my old life, had seen me step out of the gleaming black car with the subtle but unmistakable Vance crest on the door. Her eyes had widened with a mixture of curiosity and speculation that I knew would be all over town by nightfall. The call came a week later. It was Chloe. Her voice when I answered the landline in the library was a strange, syrupy concoction of shock and feigned delight. "Mom, oh my God, I've been hearing the most incredible things. Are you working for the Arthur Vance?" The way she said his name with a breathless reverence usually reserved for deities or rock stars told me everything I needed to know. She had done her research. She knew he wasn't just some wealthy old man. He was a legend, a billionaire whose net worth was a matter of public record and feverish speculation. "I'm his companion and caregiver, yes," I said calmly, my voice betraying nothing of the disgust that was rising in my throat. "A caregiver, Mom, that's amazing." She gushed her voice, a high-pitched performance of pride. "We have to celebrate. I want to hear all about it. I have to see the place. Can I come visit Ken Mark and I come for dinner this weekend?" The shift was so blatant, so shamelessly transparent, it was almost comical. Just weeks ago, I was dead weight, an inconvenience to be discarded a line item on a spreadsheet. Now suddenly, I was a golden ticket, a connection to a world of unimaginable wealth. I was her mother again, her beloved, cherished mother, who she was so terribly proud of. She wasn't seeing me, Helen. She was seeing access. She could smell the money from 50 miles away, and like a shark to blood in the water, she was coming for it. "I don't think that's a good idea, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone level and cool. "Mr. Vance is a very private man. He doesn't receive visitors." "But we're family," she protested, a new, sharp, insistent edge to her voice. The syrup was gone, replaced by the familiar sound of entitlement. "He wouldn't mind. I'm your daughter, for heaven's sake. It's the least you could do after all we've done for you." The conversation ended with her insisting she would be in the area next weekend and would just pop by. I hung up the phone with a sense of weary resignation. The piece of my new world, this fragile second spring I was nurturing with Arthur, was about to be invaded. The vulture was circling, and I knew I would have to be strong enough to keep it from landing. Chloe was true to her word. She didn't call ahead. On a bright, cloudless Saturday afternoon, as Arthur and I were sitting on the terrace overlooking the gardens, discussing the merits of David Austin roses versus old garden roses, the head of security buzzed the house intercom. His voice was professionally flat. "Ma'am, there is a Ms. Chloe Jennings at the gate. She says she is your daughter." Arthur looked at me, his expression calm and supportive, a silent transfer of strength. "It's your decision, Helen," he said quietly. "This is your home. You decide who crosses its threshold." I knew I couldn't put it off forever. To refuse her entry would only fuel her sense of righteous indignation. "Let her in," I said, my voice firm, betraying none of the weary dread I felt. I will meet her at the front door. Alone, I stood waiting in the grand echoing entryway as Chloe's car, a modest sedan that suddenly looked small and shabby on the grand sweeping driveway, pulled up to the house. She got out her eyes wide as she took in the scale of the mansion, her head swiveling like a tourist at the gates of Versailles. She was dressed up wearing a new dress that was a size too tight and a shade too bright. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she rushed forward, arms outstretched for a hug, a broad, practiced smile plastered on her face. I did not move to meet her. I stood my ground, my arms crossed, and she stopped a few feet away, her arms falling awkwardly to her sides. Mom, this place is unbelievable. She breathed, her gaze darting from the marble floors to the soaring ceilings, her mind clearly calculating the value of every painting and antique. She was like a child in a candy store, her greed poorly disguised as awe. "What do you want, Chloe?" I asked, my voice as cool and hard as the marble beneath my feet. Her cheerful facade faltered for a second. "I wanted to see you, to make sure you were okay. I was so worried about you. You weren't worried a month ago when you told me to get out of my own home." I stated not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact. Paper remembers, and so do I. Her face hardened. The mask of concern slipped, revealing the familiar pinched expression of resentment. "That was for your own good. And look, it worked out, didn't it? You landed on your feet. You landed in a palace." Her eyes swept the interior again, a covetous gleam in them. "So where is he?" "I'm dying to meet the man who's so lucky to have my mother taking care of him." She tried to push past me, to enter the heart of the house, to get to the prize, to the man whose name meant money. I blocked her way, a small old woman, standing as firm as a mountain. "He is not receiving visitors." I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "You are not welcome here, Chloe. You should leave." The pretense dropped completely then. Her face contorted into a mask of pure venom. "You can't do this to me," she hissed, her voice low and furious. "I am your daughter. You owe me. After all I've done for you." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words stole the air from my lungs. In her twisted reality, she was the victim. I was the ungrateful one. The battle line had been drawn right here on the cold marble floor of Arthur Vance's home, and I knew with absolute clarity that I would not retreat. "You owe me nothing, Chloe," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble beneath my feet. "I have given you everything. My time, my money, my love, my very life force. And you threw it all away when you threw me out. You don't get to come back now that you think there's something in it for you." Just then, the quiet, almost imperceptible hum of Arthur's wheelchair could be heard coming down the long hall. He appeared at the end of the grand entryway, positioning himself beside me, a silent, unmovable ally. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a fortress at my back. His quiet dignity, a stark contrast to my daughter's shrill desperation. Chloe's eyes darted to him, sizing him up with a greedy, calculating gaze. She saw not just a man in a wheelchair, but a vault she needed the key to. A new, desperate strategy formed on her face. She turned back to me, her expression softening into one of theatrical, overwrought concern. "Mom, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking with an emotion I knew was entirely false. Don't let this man turn you against your own family. You're vulnerable. He's an old, sick man. What kind of future is this for you? Come home. I was wrong. We can sell the house and you can have your share. We can be a family again. It was the final desperate gambit. An attempt to isolate me, to paint Arthur as a predator and herself as my savior, the prodigal daughter returning to rescue her poor, confused mother. I looked at my daughter, at the stranger. She had become a woman so disconnected from reality that she had cast herself as the heroine in a story where she was the villain. And I felt nothing but a profound and final sense of release. The ties of obligation, of guilt, of a love that had long since curdled into a weapon used against me finally snapped. The sound they made was one of freedom. I smiled, not out of revenge, but out of something stronger. Clarity. This man, I said, reaching down to place my hand on Arthur's strong, steady shoulder, is the only family I need. He has given me more respect and love in the past few weeks than you have shown me in my entire adult life. This is my home now, and you are no longer welcome in it. I turned to Arthur, my voice clear and unwavering. Would you be so kind as to have security escort Ms. Jennings from the property? Arthur simply nodded to a guard who had appeared as if by magic in the hallway. Chloe stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. As the guard gently but firmly guided her toward the door, her final words were a shriek of frustrated greed that echoed in the vast, empty space. You'll regret this. You'll die a lonely old nursemaid, and I'll be the one laughing. As the great oak door closed behind her, cutting off her ugly tirade, a profound silence fell. Arthur reached up and covered my hand with his. I looked at him, and he looked at me. No words were necessary. I hadn't lost a daughter. I had merely accepted the truth that I had lost her long, long ago. The days that followed Chloe's disastrous visit were filled with a serene quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, clear sky that felt scrubbed new. My phone, which I kept in my suite of rooms, lit up with dozens of missed calls and a flood of increasingly frantic, then abusive text messages from Chloe. I saw the notifications 99 plus in a red circle of rage, but I read none of them. I simply blocked her number and felt the last tether to my old life fall away, not with a painful snap, but with a gentle, liberating sigh. About a week later, Arthur and I were in the new rose garden. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. I was on my knees, my hands deep in the soil, planting a vibrant Mr. Lincoln bush. Arthur was watching me from the stone path, a thoughtful, almost tender expression on his face. Helen. He began, his voice serious, causing me to pause and look up at him, my hands still covered in dirt. I have spent 48 years regretting the life we never had, he said, his blue eyes intense and unwavering. I don't want to spend another single day regretting the future we could have. I am an old man, and my body is broken in ways that can never be mended. But my heart... He paused, placing a hand over his chest. My heart is whole for the first time in a very long time, and it is entirely yours. It always has been. Helen Thompson. Will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife? Tears streamed down my face, mingling with the smudges of dirt on my cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so deep and unexpected it was almost painful. I rose from the soil, my knees cracking a bit, and knelt beside his chair. I took his hand in my own two dirty ones. "Yes, Arthur." I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." We were married 2 weeks later. It was not a grand affair for the society pages. It was something better. The ceremony was held on the terrace at sunset, witnessed only by the formidable Mrs. Davenport, who actually shed a single stoic tear, and Arthur's longtime lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Abernathy. I wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Arthur wore a suit that matched the brilliant, hopeful blue of his eyes. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves. Promises not of a long and certain future, but of a true and cherished one for whatever precious time we had left. The next day, Mr. Abernathy presented me with a set of documents. There was a prenuptial agreement that Arthur had insisted on, one that gave me half of his personal fortune unconditionally. And there was a new will, which named me as his sole heir and the executor of his entire estate. Chloe's name was nowhere to be found. Paper remembers what people forget. Arthur had said to me that evening, a wry, gentle smile on his face. And I want it legally documented for all the world to see that you are not just my wife. You are my partner, the foundation of this house and of my life. He had reclaimed my value not just in his heart, but on paper, where the world could not deny it. I am writing this from a small stone cottage on the edge of Arthur's vast estate. It's my personal sanctuary, a place he had refurbished for me, with a wide, welcoming porch that overlooks a calm, quiet lake where herons nest in the reeds. The grand mansion is still there, up on the hill, a testament to a life of power and ambition. But this is my haven. This is my home. Arthur and I spend our evenings here watching the sunset paint the water in strokes of orange and gold. Our life is not one of wild adventure or youthful passion, but of deep, quiet companionship. It's a love built on shared history, on mutual respect, and on the profound gratitude of a second chance. We read, we talk, we play chess, we sit in comfortable silence. Two people who have found their way back to each other across an ocean of time and sorrow. The house is quiet now, not the empty, sterile quiet of a lonely mansion, but the kind of quiet that feels earned. The kind of quiet that feels like peace. I did not rise for revenge. I rose for clarity. My daughter wanted me out of her life, so I gave her what she asked for. I walked away, and I took with me the love she never valued, and the dignity she tried so desperately to strip from me. I hear through the grapevine, through the same invisible wires that first broadcast my new life, that she and Mark sold my old house. I hear they are already struggling with debt, having built their dreams on a foundation of greed and impatience. It is no longer my burden to carry. I am not the villain in her story, nor am I the savior. I am simply the lesson they refuse to learn, that value cannot be measured on a spreadsheet, and that love is not a resource to be exploited. If you have ever been made to feel like a burden, if you have ever been told your love was a weight instead of a gift, if you have ever been erased from your own life, then know this: you are not invisible, you are not crazy, and you are not done yet. Sometimes the family you are born into is just the starting point, the prologue to your real story. The real journey, the real work of a lifetime, is finding the family where you truly belong, the one that sees you, values you, and loves you, not for what you can provide, but for who you are. I sit on my porch, a cup of hot tea, warming my hands as the evening mist begins to rise from the lake. The first sip always burns just a little. It reminds me that I am still here, that I can still feel. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to be seen to be free. I just am. And that I have learned is more than enough. It is everything. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. This story is not just mine. It belongs to every woman who has been told she is a burden only to discover she was always the foundation. The pain of being erased by those you love is a quiet, heavy thing, but it does not have to be the end of your story. If this story stirred something in you, some quiet ache or some buried memory, then know that you are not alone. There are many of us scattered across quiet kitchens and lonely living rooms who have been underestimated. But wisdom doesn't shout. It remembers. And strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply makes a plan. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to choose between the family you were given and the peace you deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. Thank you for watching True Stories She Never Told. Your presence here gives a voice to the silent. Don't forget to subscribe to True Stories She Never Told and hit the notification bell so you don't miss another story that was never meant to be heard. Until next time, remember your worth and never let anyone else write your final chapter.